tackle about ethnic studies and postcolonial criticism.
Ethnic and postcolonial studies is an academic field that explores how race, ethnicity, culture, and power shape people's identities and experiences, especially in societies affected by colonialism. So in ethnic studies, it focuses on how different ethnic and racial groups live, interact, and are treated in society. On the other hand, postcolonial studies examine the impact of colonization on countries and people who were colonized. So, authors in the past say that our identity is fixed and it is unchanging, but authors in previous study blocks have critiqued stable, fixed notions of identity as a state, preferring to inscribe subjectivity within a fluid, variable, culturally determined, and ongoing process. In this section, the emphasis shifts, however, from gender or sexuality to ethnicity, race, and the post-colonial subjects. Okay, so previous authors challenged that idea that identity is fixed or unchanging. Instead, they argue that identity, who we are, is shaped by culture, experiences, and social processes. So this section now focuses on how identity relates specifically to ethnicity, race, and the post-colonial experience. Okay, so it means that identity is not something we are simply born with and stays the same forever. Instead, it changes depending on our culture, community, and life experiences. Think of how a Filipino living in Manila, a Filipino living in London, and a Filipino indigenous Eta person may all identify as Filipino, but experience being a Filipino differently. Their sense of identity shapes based on the environment and cultural influences. A scholar like Stuart Hall studied how culture, race, and identity are formed in society. He has noted a revisioning or splitting of the term ethnicity between the dominant notion, which connects to nation and race, and the recognition that we all speak from a particular place, out of a particular history, out of a particular experience, a particular culture. We are all, in this sense, ethnically located. Okay, so it means that, according to Hall, ethnicity is not only about race or nationality. He says that everyone speaks from a unique cultural background shaped by history and experience. Therefore, everyone has an ethnic identity, not just minority groups. For example, a Filipino student may think ethnicity only applies to groups like Igorot, Tausug, or Eta, but Hall says being Tagalog, Ilocano, or even English or American is also an ethnic identity because it each comes from a distinct cultural background. Hall's linkage of particularity to commonality, we all speak from a particular place or etc., unfolds ethnicities such as Englishness, which have traditionally survived by marginalizing, dispossessing, displacing, and forgetting other ethnicities. This means that Englishness maintained its power by erasing or minimizing the identities of others. For instance, during British rule in India, the British promoted their own culture, English language, education, values, while portraying Indian culture as inferior or uncivilized. This made Englishness appear superior and universal, forcing colonized people to forget or hide their own cultural identities. Brutalizing project of Englishness in colonies under British imperial rule and its questioning by intellectuals and critics of the second half of the 20th century lie at the heart of what has come to be known as post-colonial criticism. Post-colonial criticism emerged as scholars questioned the dominance of Englishness in colonized regions. This field studies the effects of colonial rule and how colonized people resisted, survived, and redefined themselves. Okay, so after World War II, scholars like Frantz Fanon, Edward Said, and Gayatri Spivak began criticizing how colonizers controlled not only land but also culture. For example, Edward Said's concept of Orientalism shows how Europe falsely portrayed Asian and Middle Eastern people as exotic, irrational, or backward to justify colonial rule. These criticisms became a foundation of post-colonial studies. Within a post-structuralist environment and drawing on its methodology, post-colonial critics analyze the repercussions of European cultural and territorial expansion from its beginnings to the present day. They examine the mutually reinforcing enterprise of colonialism and the cultures of the colonizers, as well as the interaction between colonizers and the colonized. Using post-structuralist methods, post-colonial critics analyze how colonialism shaped both colonizers and colonized societies. They study how European expansion affected culture, power, and identity, and how these effects continue today. Post-colonial studies look not only at historical colonization but also at its ongoing impacts. For example, the use of English as the main language in the Philippines is a legacy of American colonization. Preference for lighter skin in many Asian countries is partly influenced by colonial beauty standards. And the educational curriculum in former colonies often centers Western authors and ideas, ignoring local perspectives. So these show how colonization still influences people long after independence.
Postcolonial aims at recovering the marginalized, excluded, or otherwise silenced voices of colonial and subaltern voices. Finally, postcolonial studies explore and theorize identity as determined by colonial and postcolonial experiences, national affiliation, and a globalized world. So it means that post-colonial studies aim to bring back the voices of people who were ignored, pushed aside, or silenced during and after the colonial period. These people are often called subaltern, those who lack power and a voice. It also explore and create theories about identity, who is a person, and when that person or identity of a person is shaped. The field emerged in the second half of the 20th century after World War II, when the colonial enterprise started breaking down and European colonial powers such as France and England granted independence to many of its colonies. So during after World War II, or the study really took off in the mid-1990s. This was the time when the colonial system began to fall apart and European powers like France and England started to giving independence to many of their colonies around the world. Internal colonial situations such as those suffered by African Americans in the United States and the black majority in South Africa face significant and mounting challenges to racist practices and abuse. Colonial hegemony have been enforced by the imposition of the colonizers' language and cultures, and attention in the post-colonial studies turned to the rule of literature, which, as Michael Ryan notes, came to be seen as a privileged site for understanding the social structure, cultural codes, and psychological tropes of cross-cultural and inter-ethnic understanding and misunderstanding. So these slides means that even with powerful countries, groups suffered from a form of internal colonization. For instance, African Americans in the United States and the black majority in South Africa strongly challenge racist practices and abuse. So we all know nga ang mga black American before is na feel gid nila graces, it is because of their colors. And colonizers, rulers maintain their power by forcing their own language and culture onto the colonized people. So, muning ginatawag na hegemony. Because of this, post-colonial studies focus on literature, books, and writing. So, according to Michael Ryan, that literature became a place to understand the social rules, cultural patterns, and ways of thinking that cause understanding and misunderstanding between different culture and ethnic groups. So before, the literature plays a vital role, no, when kanang giving or providing information to the people. Race and ethnicity interest us for the ways in which they are represented, mediated, or otherwise signified through literary texts. Ryan reminds us that culturally constructed racial or ethnic identities bear a specific relationship to literature. Much of the most influential post-colonial criticism has been generated by authors who were born in formerly colonized nations. So it means that the way we understand race and ethnicity isn't just biological, it's created by culture and society. Michael Ryan points out that culturally based racial and ethnic identities are directly connected to how literature is written and read. A lot of the most important literary analysis about these topics comes from post-colonial criticism. So, the authors that written this literature are the ones who grow up in countries that were once under the rule of the colonial power. So these authors now bring a unique and powerful perspective to how race, power, and identity are handled in writing. It is because they also experienced it. They saw the events, what is happening around the world. They are there. The Nigerian author and critic Chinua Achebe's essay, An Image of Africa, Racism in Conrad's Heart of Darkness, is a foundational text of post-colonial criticism. It exposes the racism that lies at the heart of darkness, a racism in which Western culture is given the privileged status of Conrad's text in Western canon. So this famous story called Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad is a brilliant book about European people exploring Africa. However, Chinua Achebe argued that the book treats African people and the continent of Africa itself as just a dark, primitive background for white European characters. It gives Western culture a privileged status or an honored place while dismissing or demeaning African people. Another influential critic, Edward says Orientalism is one of the most foremost landmark created with having laid the groundwork for the field. So Orientalism explains that for hundreds of years, the Western world or Europe and America has created a simplified, often untrue and mystical idea of the Middle East, Asia, and North Africa. So this idea shown that it wasn't just a mistake, it was a way for the West to feel superior and to justify ruling over this region and people. These two critics shows that even famous work of literature and ideas can be deeply flawed and racist, and they give us the tools to analyze those flaws. Said, Interacting with the emerging post-structuralist theory, he was one of Michel Foucault's most distinguished disciples. Drawing on his studies of discourse and power, or discourse as power, to elucidate the function of cultural representation on the construction and maintenance of first and third world relations. So this discourse as power means that the way we speak, our knowledge and language are the tools used to create, maintain, and control social reality. So Said use this idea, the discourse as power, to understand the relationship between the first world and the third world. Said showed how cultural representation are used to construct and maintain this relation. However, those cultural representation, like images and story, often shows that third world country is weak, mysterious, or needing to be saved. However, the first world country is rich, developed, and often former colonial powers who feel superiors.
Okay, now let's proceed to the next slide. Edward Said wanted to understand how we can create fair, non-controlling knowledge about people and cultures even though our world is already full of politics, power struggles, and hidden biases. In his work, Orientalism Reconsidered, he asked, how can we talk about other cultures without dominating them or forcing our own ideas onto them? Said also introduced the term the other. This means the way Europeans created fixed, exaggerated, and often negative images of the Orient, like Asia, the Middle East, etc. During the imperialism, these stereotypes made those cultures seem strange, different, or inferior. Said and Spivak study how imperialism, colonial power, controls people, not just through force but through ideas, language, and stereotypes. They show how this power affects the everyday lives of colonized people, who are often treated as the other, strange, inferior, or different, or as the subaltern, those who are forced to the lowest social position and cannot freely speak for themselves. Baba uses deconstruction, a method of breaking apart and examining ideas, to criticize the unfair power relationships created by colonialism. Gayatri Spivak and Homi Bhabha, both important thinkers from South Asia, helped push post-colonial studies forward. They connected theory like big ideas about culture, identity, and power with real political struggles, especially the fight against imperialism. Baba says we should break down the old either-or categories that make national cultures seem fixed, pure, and unchanging. These old binaries like one culture versus another make it look as if cultures and identities are simple and uniform. Postcolonial studies looks at how European colonialism has shaped the world from the 15,000s until today. It tries to understand not only what colonizers did, but also how their actions still affect countries cultures, and identities now.
One major issue concerns the nature of representations. A big problem is how people, place, or cultures are shown. These representations are often not accurate or fair, and also they can create wrong image that affect how others see a group. Following Edward Said's Orientalism, postcolonial critics have examined the ways in which Western representation of third world countries serve the political interests of their makers. So Edward Said explained that Western countries often describe the third world in biased ways. Postcolonial critics study how these descriptions have the West maintain power, and these representations support the political goals of those who create them. Postcolonial critics problematize objective perception, pointing out the unbalanced power relation that typically shape the production of knowledge. These critics say that what looks objective is not really neutral. Knowledge is often created by those who have more power, and this makes information biased, favoring the powerful and limiting the weak. The West has constructed the third world as an other. The Western countries often describe third world nations as very different from themselves. They treat these countries as outsiders or not equal. This creates a divide between us and them. Such ideological projections typically become the negative terms of binary oppositions, in which the positive terms are normative representations of the West. Though the Western ideas often put the West on the good side and the third world on the bad side. This opposite make the West look normal, superior, or ideal. And meanwhile, the third world countries are shown as weak, backward, or damaging. Stereotypes circulate through anthropological, historical, and literary texts, as well as mass media such as newspaper, television, and cinemas. These negative ideas appear in books, academic studies, and historical writing. They also spread through newspapers, TV shows, movies, and other media. Because of this, many people believe this false or harmful image. A related line of inquiry in postcolonial theory studies how institutions of Western education function in the spread of imperialism. Postcolonial scholars also examine how Western schools and universities spread Western power. They argue that education can be a tool of control. Through schooling, Western ideas and values are spread in colonized countries. Historical documents such as Thomas Babington Macaulay minute on Indian education, how education show that education, including the study of English literature and the English language plays a strategic part in ruling over colonized people. Documents from history prove that teaching English and English literature was not neutral. It was used to help control colonized people by shaping how people think. Education helps support colonial rule, as it inculcates Western Eurocentric values. Literary education support a kind of cultural colonization, creating a class of colonial subjects, often burdened by a double consciousness and by divided loyalties. Learning only Western ideas makes the student absorb Western values. This creates cultural colonization, where people begin to see their own culture as unfair. It also causes identity conflict because they feel torn between their own culture and Western culture. It helps Western colonizers rule by consent rather than by violence. And when people accept Western ideas, they are easier to control. They may follow colonial rule willingly instead of resisting. This allows colonizers to rule without using force.